After a long hiatus, we are excited to be back at Cato for the Libertarianism versus Conservatism Intern debate. Now, more than ever, discussion regarding the nuances of political philosophy is pivotal. And that brings us here tonight on this stage to delve into these political philosophies and learn about their distinct approaches to policy issues. These interns have put in a lot of work this summer, and we're very pleased to have the participation of young professionals such as them here in this debate. We hope that you will all be encouraged to further explore these political philosophies and the educational resources each institution has available. Very special thanks to Mary Catherine Mahalik of the Heritage Foundation, as well as Ross Huffam, now at the John Jay Institute, for working with us on this for several months. We're also very grateful to Heritage more broadly for their cooperation and coordination. Before I continue, I want to convey that we are deeply saddened by the passing of Ed Follner, the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation. Ed was a respected conservative thinker and institution builder whose influence reached far beyond his own organization. He offered encouragement and mentorship to many, including scholars here at Cato, on issues where our principles and goals overlapped. Though we might not have always seen eye to eye on every policy issue and every philosophical point, including on some of the issues that will be debated here tonight, there was never any doubt about Ed's sincerity, commitment, and dedication to advancing ideas he genuinely believed served this country's best interests. We engaged constructively with Heritage while Ed was at the helm, and Cato will continue our commitment to working with all sides of the political spectrum, left, right, or center, on issues that we find common ground on. We extend our sincere condolences to Ed's family, friends, and his colleagues at the Heritage Foundation. His legacy as a passionate advocate for principles we hold dear at Cato, like free markets and limited government, will not soon be forgotten. Now, one thing to keep in mind that's very important, especially when posting on social media about the debate, these interns will each be arguing for the libertarian and conservative sides on policy issues from a broad viewpoint. In that vein, the arguments made here tonight do not necessarily reflect the opinions of those interns, nor do they necessarily reflect the opinions of the Cato Institute or the Heritage Foundation. I'd also ask, please reserve applause for the very end and do not disrupt the debate to ensure that we end on time. In the coming days, you will be receiving an email from us with a link to a survey. We want to hear whom you thought made the most compelling arguments tonight, as well as your individual stance on these issues. Ultimately, once the answers are collected, you'll be free to view them on our website. With all that said, please come onto the stage, intern debaters, for introductions. Debating for Libertarianism. Ben Woods is an intern in Technology Policy Studies, and Samia Leroya is an intern in the Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Debating for Conservatism, Daniel Davidson is interning in the Edwin Meese III Center for Judicial and Legal Studies, and Chloe Noller is interning in Government Relations at the Heritage Foundation. We sincerely appreciate the energy, but please reserve applause till the end of the debate. Thank you. And thank you to all of these interns here for all your hard work in preparing for this sensational debate. Lastly, I'd like to thank Matthew Continetti, who has agreed to moderate tonight's debate. Matthew Continetti is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies and the inaugural Patrick and Charlene Neal Chair in American Prosperity at the American Enterprise Institute, where his work is focused on American political thought and history. A prominent journalist, analyst, author, and intellectual historian, Mr. Continetti was the founding editor and the editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon and is a columnist at the Free Press. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for this debate up to the stage.
Thank you, Connor, and thank you all for coming here and for inviting me back to this second post-pandemic conservative libertarian debate, the first since the pandemic, here in the Cato Institute in this very nicely refurbished auditorium. I feel like I'm in a Marvel movie with the background behind me, and I'm looking forward to the debate and discussion. It's also poignant to be here. This is the first time I've visited Cato since the death of David Bose last year. It was extremely important to many young people who were interested in the philosophy of freedom, including myself. I distinctly remember seeing David give the book notes interview for the Libertarian Mind and the Libertarian Reader when they came out in the early 90s. And that inspired me to check out those books and to learn more about libertarianism, which eventually led to my interest in conservatism. Since the mid-20th century, the conservative movement has defended America's political tradition of ordered liberty. Both parts of this mixed compound sustain human dignity: order to keep the peace and freedom to live as we see fit. But sometimes, you may have noticed, authority and liberty come into conflict. Some people prefer one element to the other. And we've seen this tension play out in the lives of many leaders on the right. William F. Buckley Jr., the architect of the modern American conservative movement, was a devout Catholic whose religious views shaped his political outlook. Yet he branded himself a libertarian journalist, opposed the war on drugs, and stood firmly for free markets. Ronald Reagan, whose presidency was the greatest success of Buckley's conservative project, proclaimed, and I quote, that the very heart and soul of conservatism is libertarianism. When Reagan was president, syndicated columnist and author George Will was a self-professed Tory who criticized libertarianism for its, what he called its lack of moral content. But today, George Will calls himself a classical liberal, and his political positions are rooted in a deep suspicion of the state, and he, of course, is very fond of this institution. And yet it is precisely this healthy competition and cooperation between conservative and libertarian impulses that has made the right such an influential political force. And I would just like to take a moment to second Connor and reflect on the legacy of a man whose career exemplified how conservative and libertarian ideas join to shape American politics and culture, and that is Edwin J. Fulner. Ed Fulner died last week at the age of 83. He co-founded the Heritage Foundation with Paul Weyrich and Joseph Coors in 1973. Their goal was to create a new kind of think tank that would advance conservative ideas in the legislative and executive branches of government. When the Reagan administration began, Ed's advocacy would make the right's ideas not just respectable, but mainstream. In Heritage's mandate for leadership, the think tank provided the Reagan administration with concrete proposals for revitalizing the economy, strengthening national security, and halting the centralization of power in Washington. Victories that were unthinkable in the 1970s came to define the 1980s and beyond. One generation later, when Heritage released a new edition of Mandate for Leadership to inform the first Trump administration, 2/3 of its policy recommendations were enacted within 1 calendar year. These days, Mandate for Leadership has a new name. You may have heard of it, Project 2025. Both conservative and libertarian principles shaped Ed Fulner's life and work. His career demonstrated that a robust American right requires a delicate balance of valid competing ideas and values. His intellectual heroes were Russell Kirk, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman. Kirk was a traditionalist who emphasized community over individualism. Hayek famously declared that he was not a conservative. And Milton Friedman was, of course, a libertarian who championed individual freedom. But as Ed wrote in the introduction to his wonderful essay collection, The March of Freedom, his respect for these figures was not schizophrenic. Kirk, Hayek, and Friedman all opposed social engineering. They all believed that freedom requires strong mediating institutions to endure, and they all revived as what Ed called the conservative faith. He dedicated his career to unifying the right's various factions around this common purpose, and I believe that career is instructive for today's climate. Ed once observed that the American rights work will not be completed until freedom no longer needs champions. And I'm taking that quote as our guide. We know that we have a lot of work to do. Until then, Ed Fulner said, there is room for new epic accomplishments in this living tradition, this great and honorable adventure. And I'm thrilled to be here with the next generation of happy warriors who will continue the adventure. So please join me in welcoming our debaters as we turn to Cato to begin our first opening statement. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I want to get started by emphasizing that I'm not here to recruit people away from conservatism or towards libertarianism, though I certainly wouldn't mind if you did change your mind. I'm also not here to criticize conservative values. In fact, conservatives tend to have a lot of the same intuitions about the world that libertarians do. We just have different ideas on how to structure a society that reflects those intuitions. So my goal here tonight is to share with everyone a new philosophy, a new perspective, not as a challenge to conservatism, but as an invitation to think critically about where our principles align, where they diverge, and where each approach is most effective in securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, as libertarians, we believe in individual liberty, free markets, and peace. To us, individual liberty means the right of every person to live as they choose, so long as they're not harming others. It means the freedom to worship according to your own conscience, the freedom to love who you love. It means the right to arm and defend yourself, and the right to speak your mind. Personally, it's my favorite tenet, and what a lot of libertarians tend to be most proud of. We've stood for the abolition of slavery, for religious liberty, women's suffrage, LGBTQ rights, gun rights, bodily autonomy, free speech, and the right to privacy. Our notions of liberty extend to the marketplace too. We believe in the right to participate in voluntary exchange free from state control, to work, trade, and innovate without needing government permission. On this front, we have a lot in common with old school conservatives who recognized the economic flourishing that came with free enterprise and trade. Libertarians stand against corporate cronyism, against overregulation that crushes small business, protectionism that raises prices, corporate subsidies and bailouts, and high taxes on hardworking Americans. On the topic of peace, I think it's certainly worth celebrating that conservatives have trended towards less interventionist foreign policy in the recent years. And libertarians have long held that war is the greatest destroyer of freedom, and that our government should put the lives and liberties of Americans first. Americans do not have a great track record when it comes to foreign wars, and we libertarians vehemently oppose policy that spills American blood in distant lands. Moving from these broader values into the topic policies of the debate, let's take a moment to frame today's questions of immigration, trade policy, and philosophy of governance. The libertarian stance we'll be taking on immigration today is that the United States would benefit from increased pathways to legalized immigration. I want to make clear that we're not endorsing illegal immigration or open borders. We're supporting increased pathways to legal immigration as the best way towards American prosperity. The libertarian stance we'll be taking on trade is that the United States benefits from expansion of free trade and reduction of protectionist barriers, that tariffs and trade restrictions only raise costs, stifle innovation, and hurt the people they claim to protect. The libertarian stance we're taking on philosophy is that liberty from below is preferable to virtue from above. And as a proud Virginia resident, I feel obliged to share a very relevant James Madison quote to our conversation today. Conscience is the most sacred of all property. When the government imposes its own version of virtue, it strips individuals of the freedom to live by their own values. Our ways of life cannot and should not be dictated from above, and to place moral authority in the hands of the state is to accept that our moral code will shift with every election, every administration, and every change in power. If we want a nation that endures, it must be built not on the preferences of politicians, but on the rights of the people. That is the libertarian promise, and that is the vision we invite you to consider tonight.
Whether to allow slavery. A right, he said, grounded in autonomy and popular sovereignty. Abraham Lincoln stood opposed. He declared that true democracy is not simply majority will. It must be tethered to moral law. Because liberty, unanchored from virtue, even in the words of a libertarian philosopher, John Locke, says it's a state of license. License leads to tyranny. Let's be clear. In that debate, Douglass stood for the libertarian philosophy. He worshiped choice. Lincoln was the conservative. He grounded his arguments in the founders' principles that wanted to eradicate slavery, in a moral, ordered liberty. And that order didn't originate in 1776, but was inherited from Athens, Jerusalem, Rome, and London. The founders knew this. As we well know, John Adams warned, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. That Constitution, our national compass, was ordained to form a more perfect union, to uphold justice, preserve peace, to defend our people, support the welfare of the citizenry, to secure liberty not just for ourselves, but for our posterity. That is the conservative mission, not a libertarian utopian abstraction, but a constitutional republic rooted in duty and responsibility and preserved for our posterity. That's why conservatives secure borders, not because we lack compassion, but because upholding justice begins with knowing who we are and who we protect. Libertarians would scoff at borders, treating nations as economic zones and citizenship as a mere accident of birth. Tell that to the families of children, mothers, and fathers who have lost loved ones, to men who should have never entered this country. A borderless nation is a non-existent nation. And what of our economy? Libertarians would exalt the free market almost like a deity, but they sacrifice American families in pursuit of the false idea that efficiency is the only end of trade. In reality, millions of jobs are lost and hardworking American families are displaced. When the economy serves only itself, we lose more than paychecks. We lose the glue that holds civil society together. Rational self-interest assumes that all members of society function like an able-bodied man. The strong will always benefit and the weak will always suffer. Even give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry said, a corrupted public conscience is incompatible with freedom. The government is a social signaler, whether we like it or not. When we legalize vice, destigmatize disorder, and erase the lines that once protected the most vulnerable, we're not advancing freedom. We're sowing chaos. Scholar Harry Jaffa once wrote, "That man is no friend of free government, who flatters the people into believing that whatever they wish to have is right." Yet libertarians shrink from moral duty, reducing their reasoning to self-interest, masquerading as the protection of civil liberties. Conservatives reject that moral shrug. We understand, as Lincoln did, that democracy demands self-restraint, that rights come from our creator, not the creature, that faith, family, and duty are not private relics, but fundamentally foundational to our society. As de Tocqueville put it, liberty cannot be established without morality, nor morality without faith. That's why the Declaration begins not with man's autonomy, but with God's authority. So tonight, we're not just debating economics or border policy. We're debating the kind of country we want to be in. A country that protects and puts first its own citizens, or one adrift in reckless individualism. We want immigration policies that respect America as a nation, economic and trade policy that puts American industry first, a social policy that takes a moral stance on moral issues, a government that remembers why it was established in the first place. Thank you.
Okay, so for the first topic, we're going to be debating the policy issue of immigration, and the debate will begin with the Team Heritage.
Hello again. Kyla Hamilton was just 20 years old when she was tied up, raped, and strangled by a foam cord by an MS-13 gang member, an illegal alien who should never have been here. Jocelyn Nungry was only 12 when her body was found in a creek, raped and killed by 2 illegal immigrants from Venezuela. Elizabeth Medina was 16, stabbed to death by an illegal immigrant from Mexico. These are not abstract statistics. These are real American citizens, women and children who were violently murdered. And every one of them is dead because someone who had no right to be here was here. Every one of those crimes was preventable, if only we had a government with the moral will to enforce its own laws. Libertarians will tell you on their Cato website that borders are lines on a paper, that freedom of migration is sacred, that no human is illegal. But the first duty of a civilized society is to protect its own citizens from violence. Don't take my word for it. That was David Boaz, who was the vice president of the Cato Institute. So tell me, how does an open border protect our citizens? How does refusing to deport violent criminals keep Americans safe? For the past 4 years, we've seen what open borders do. That's the fatal contradiction in libertarianism. It demands that we value liberty, but turns a blind eye when that liberty costs innocent lives. We are a nation of immigrants. That is good. That is essential. But we should know who's in our country. Conservative policy promotes legal immigration. In the words of Thomas Friedman, tall walls and wide gates. We want people who love America to come legally, with a visa, to work and thrive in the greatest and freest nation on earth. We want people who seek opportunity and freedom under the rule of law established by our Constitution. But there is nothing virtuous, nothing just, nothing compassionate about allowing violent offenders and illegal immigrants to roam free inside of our country, living off American taxpayer dollars and taking American jobs. Reagan once said, "A nation that cannot control its borders is not a nation." But that's exactly what the libertarian vision demands, a non-nation, a marketplace, a transit zone, an abstract ideal, but not a country, not a nation bound by its shared tradition, values, and history. They'll say it's uncompassionate, even as the black market and human trafficking thrives, as fentanyl, cocaine, and heroin have flooded our streets. They say just don't hurt people, but promote the policies that allow illegal immigrants to murder American children in American neighborhoods. They ignore the Constitution itself, which was ordained to provide for the common defense and ensure domestic tranquility. Is it really authoritarian to deport a criminal who crossed our border illegally? Is it really tyranny to respect America as a nation, to protect American citizens. That sounds like ensuring domestic tranquility. Libertarians want you to believe that public policy is effective only if it maximizes individual autonomy. But that idea falls apart when you're standing at the funeral of a 12-year-old girl who was murdered because her murderer was just let in by the government. How many American citizens must be murdered or die from fentanyl overdoses before they believe that the government should do something? Conservative policy wants a secure border, a functioning immigration system, a country that knows who is in it and why. That's not extremism. That's basic governance. It's common sense. It's fulfilling what even David Boaz, former Cato Institute's vice president, called the first priority of a civilized society, protecting its own citizens from violence. Libertarians will say that the nation is a mere abstraction. Jocelyn, Kyla, Camilla, Elizabeth, and so many others certainly were not. They were Americans. And they were killed because this country, their country, forgot to put them first. Libertarian philosophy would put criminals over citizens, but we must enforce the rule of law, deport those who break it, because a government that won't protect its own citizens doesn't deserve to call itself a government at all. Thank you.
I want to get started by addressing some of the conservative concerns that were just raised. Most notably is that of crime and national safety, but also was touched on the economic element and wage suppression and the taking of jobs. But starting from this crime and safety issue, I want to make 2 points understood. First off is that immigrants engage in criminal activity at rates significantly lower than Americans. And second is that current immigration policy, current American deportation policy, is diverting massive amounts of money and resources away from preventing the crime and violence that conservatives just raised, that our opponents just raised here. If we look to the numbers, we see that undocumented immigrants are incarcerated at rates 40% less, and legal immigrants at 70% less. We see that the ICE annual budget was $75 billion, putting it larger than most military countries on Earth. But instead of focusing on genuine threats to public safety, instead of focusing on preventing horrific violence and human trafficking and drug trafficking, instead, as a former ICE official has actually put it, the focus of the agency has moved to arresting gardeners instead of detaining violent criminals, instead of taking on drug and human trafficking. And that is the argument that libertarians are making when it comes to immigration policy. It's not an endorsement of violence and crime, and it's not an endorsement of illegal immigration. It's that we need increased pathways to legal immigration, and that we need to focus our law enforcement and border resources on preventing violent crime as opposed to deporting gardeners. I also want to talk a little bit about wage suppression, as was just touched on, and I want to make clear that immigrants are very essential to meeting the labor needs and growing our economy, to building American prosperity. Right now, the United States has close to 8 million jobs that are open, and it's facing shortages in sectors like agriculture, construction, and caregiving. Immigrants, they fill these gaps. They allow businesses to stay open, take on new work, and expand. That growth increases wages. It has seen a 2.6% increase in non-college educated Americans and smaller increases across the board. The overall wage effects are positive. And beyond labor supply, immigrants are creating demand, they're consumers, they're renting homes, buying food, using services. They are in no way taking jobs away from American citizens. They are very clearly enhancing the pie that is America. They're allowing more Americans to have more of everything. And that's the case for immigration. I want to move a little bit more into the economics of this. Libertarians believe that borders shouldn't stand in the way of peaceful exchange, and that applies to ideas, goods, or labor. A farmer hiring a willing worker, a hospital bringing in a needed nurse, or a family reuniting across borders are not threats to regulate. Those are freedoms to respect. And I also want to emphasize that at its core, immigration policy is economic policy. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that immigrants will add $7 trillion to the economy over the next 10 years. And not so long ago, Heritage recognized a simple fact. They stated that the combination of immigrant talent and homegrown ingenuity was a formula for economic growth, and admitted that without it, US GDP would be much smaller. Now, it's easy to treat the economic dimension of immigration as something abstract. In fact, just now we heard the conservatives try to describe the economy and society as somehow at odds, as if growing the economy is worse for Americans when it comes to certain immigration issues. But there's nothing abstract about who grows our food, nothing abstract about who runs our hospitals, who keeps our shelves stocked, the construction sites running. Immigrants make up 27% of agriculture, 16% of healthcare, and 25% of construction. They're a core part of the economy, and they're a core part of American society and life. And right now, we just don't have enough workers to meet that demand. There's only 60 unemployed people for every 100 open jobs. And that gap affects everything. It affects all Americans, from food prices to waits at your local clinic. When labor supply can't meet demand, consumers feel it. They feel it at the grocery store, in hospital waiting rooms, and in the rising cost of living. In this context, immigration is not a border issue, it's an economic one. And it's one of the most far-reaching forms of economic regulation that we are enacting right now. As libertarians understand well, overregulation of markets comes at a steep, steep cost. High prices, slow growth, and fewer opportunities for everyone. And today, our conservative opposition raised the point that they're endorsing legal immigration. And libertarians actually are. But conservative immigration policy does not suggest that they support legal immigration. Right now, there's a lesser than 3% rate of acceptance in the United States. It takes years, if not decades, and it takes tens of thousands of dollars. It's no surprise that with how impossible it is to immigrate legally, we have increased illegal immigration and all of the problems that come with it. Thank you.
You just heard a lot about economics, but I encourage you to remember these names. Kyla Hamilton was just 20 years old when she was raped, tied up, and strangled with a phone cord by an illegal alien. Jocelyn Nungari was only 12 when her body was found in a creek and raped, and she was killed by 2 illegal immigrants from Venezuela. What did Cato say, or have to say, to Kyla and her family? What about Jocelyn's parents? To all the victims of the crimes that never would have occurred if we had a different immigration policy. As David Boaz, the deceased vice president of Cato Institute, would state, the first duty of the civilized society is to protect its own citizens from violence. But what did Kayla's and Jocelyn's parents just hear? What would Cato say to them? All they heard was supply and demand. We agree with our libertarian friends that economics are important, but they don't justify throwing out our laws that protect the innocent members of our communities. Now, you also heard from our Cato friends that they suggest that Kyla's murder is an outlier, that most ICE deportations are about deporting gardeners, but that's simply wrong. That's not based on the numbers. The most recent numbers we have show that 70% of ICE arrests were criminal illegal aliens with convictions or pending charges. Those aren't gardeners. That's not who you see when you see who's being arrested. That's not the priority of ICE. And the reason why ICE has such a large budget is because we've had open border policies for so long. The system has been overwhelmed. That's why we're having to have this debate. And we do have solutions. We have solutions that can close the border. You can drastically mitigate illegal immigration with conservative policies. Stay in Mexico works. Walls work. We need to have actual border policy enforced, because otherwise we have 10,000 people coming across the border at its peak every single day. ICE finds enough fentanyl to kill every single American. That's just in what they collect from the known people that are apprehended, not gotaways. If we want to take this policy seriously, and if we also want to make sure that we're not punishing legal immigrants who wait in line, who take their time to go the right way, then we need to actually enforce our border. Because there's nothing that's more insulting to some of the most patriotic and hardworking members of our communities than when they wait in line, they follow the legal pathways, then they get cut in line by criminal illegal aliens, and they serve no consequences. The policy is about having broad, open doors. It's fundamentally an issue of Congress. Go petition them, but don't give up on the rule of law. Thank you.
I want to raise a couple points. First off, some matters of fact. First of which, probably most important, is that our conservative opposition pointed to the fact that many of the arrests and deportations were of immigrants with criminal records. If you look closer at this data, however, you will see that the overwhelming majority of the records of these immigrants were immigration violations. They weren't property crimes, they weren't violent crimes, they weren't the kind of crime that they're telling stories about. Most of these immigrants, the only thing they did wrong was come into this country. They did nothing for which Americans would face any sort of legal repercussions for. The data is very clear on this. It's very clear that immigrants are not violent individuals. And when you look at the number that have histories of violent crime, it's under 10%. I believe it's 8%. I also want to raise the fact that the conservative opposition continues to tout legal immigration as sort of the solution to this. But at the same time, they enact policies that make it practically impossible to enter the country legally. As I said before, 3% acceptance rate, 2 years, at least 2 years to decades, tens of thousands of dollars. It's impossible to come into this country legally, and then they point to illegal immigration as a problem when when it's really a symptom of a broader immigration problem. On the topic of fentanyl and drugs coming into this country, I also want to raise the fact that 86% of fentanyl coming into this country is found from U.S. citizens, and most of it is occurring at legal ports of entry. It's not occurring through illegal immigrants across the border. And that really brings us back to the main point that libertarians are trying to make on this topic, which is that the current amount of spending on largely policing nonviolent, hardworking immigrants is a public safety threat. It's the reason that we're seeing some of the violence and drug trafficking that conservatives are concerned about. It's because we spend $75 billion on ICE. We spend $75 billion and then give them objectives not to stop crime, not to stop drug trafficking, not to stop violent offenders, and instead focus on getting the numbers as high as can be. And all that does is it robs Americans of much-needed economic contributions, but more importantly, it unjustly removes immigrants and diverts resources from focusing on public safety. That's what law enforcement resources need to be spent on instead of building more of the wall. We've seen in the past this is not effective, and we need to focus on protecting Americans as opposed to punishing immigrants. Thank you.
Topic 2 this evening is international trade. Is it good or bad? And we begin with Cato.
Our claim today is simple. Free trade drives prosperity, and protectionism destroys it. For decades, America was the world's greatest example that free trade led to stronger innovation, more robust growth, and a greater quality of life. The libertarian defense of free trade has never been more urgent because today's tariffs could steamroll all the progress we've made. The conservative side today will tell you that free trade is good until they need an exception, because suddenly it's free trade, but not with China, free trade, but not for semiconductors. But we're here with something they can't offer you, a consistent, airtight thesis. Protectionism, no matter who it targets, hits our economy hardest. Tariffs drive up prices, they stifle innovation, and they squeeze the households least able to afford it. I'm sure both the conservatives and the libertarians in this room stand together in opposing onerous corporate taxes. So I'm excited to hear why conservatives are suddenly for corporate taxes when they're called tariffs. I'm also excited to hear how a tariff on Chinese baby blankets is going to help our Department of Defense. But keep in mind, conservatives want you to believe that this debate is all about China, except China is only 10% of US trade. The real protectionist threat? It's bigger and it's global. Every single country in the world pays this administration's 10% baseline tariff. And if tariffs are meant to push free trade deals, we'd like an explanation for why we're tariffing our closest allies like South Korea, which has a near zero tariff on US goods. Whether the tariff is on China or Canada, it's not going to change this basic fact. Tariffs are a tax on US businesses and US consumers. In fact, it's one of the most regressive kinds of taxes possible. It's going to disproportionately burden lower-income consumers who spend a larger share of their budget on traded goods. And what's most incredible about protectionism is how bad it is at helping the very industries it's supposed to protect. So let's look at the 2018 steel tariffs. Did it save American jobs? Well, according to the Federal Reserve, in steel-consuming industries, there were 75,000 fewer jobs in 2019. Protectionism also claims that domestic reshoring increases the resilience of our supply chain. And my conservative friend earlier said that libertarians care about the free market, and the free market leaves families behind. But during the pandemic, one of our most nationalized industries, baby formula, suffered the worst shortage. A single factory closure shut down the entire US market, and parents faced 8 months of shortages that only went away when the tariffs went away. So I'd encourage their conservative friends to take that claim and tell it to a mother who can't feed her child. Tariff regimes breed corruption and complacency. Exemptions turn into handouts for the well-connected, lobbyists cash in, and the only industry booming is crony capitalism. Meanwhile, small businesses, unable to buy favors or absorb costs, are the first to go under. So when you consider which policy is better, ask yourself, if you owned a small business, would you want to live under constant executive action tariff uncertainty? If you were a new mother, how would you feel when baby formula goes out of the shelves, when that new stroller costs $300 more? What happens if 200% pharmaceutical tariffs hit the medication you need to survive? Beth Beneke is a mom, a veteran, and a small business owner of a company that sells baby products. Products that were suddenly subject to a 145% tariff on Chinese imports. This put her under pressure to pay $230,000, on top of what she already paid for her products just to get them into the country. This was money she couldn't afford. She had to take out a loan that was partially leveraged against her house. If her business fails, she loses the house she's raising her 8-year-old son in. So let me reiterate, tariffs are a tax. They're a tax that crushes small businesses, destroys jobs, and throttles innovation. They also entrench special interests, and almost impossible to remove even after the economic failures are painfully clear. Frederick Bastiat pointed out that when goods cannot cross borders, armies will. Trade is integral to peace. It creates economic incentives for it. It humanizes people. And there's only one type of policy that creates hostility and invites retaliation, and it's protectionism. The conservative side wants to use a sledgehammer for what at most needs a scalpel. Libertarian policy has the wisdom of history on our side. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act promised jobs. What it delivered was a fast-track ticket to the Great Depression. It was trade liberalization efforts after World War II that powered American incomes and put an additional $1 trillion in the pockets of American workers. Free trade powered the American century. In today's protectionism, we're shutting it all down. Thank you.
A mentor of mine once jokingly told me there are two types of libertarians. There's bow tie, and then there's tie-dye. And neither of them live in rural western Pennsylvania. That's who's affected by trade. And trade is about more than just protecting the small-town rural farm worker and the Rust Belt steel worker. It's about national defense. Conservative trade policy can be boiled down to two common-sense points. Protect national security and give the American people a fair deal. Being dependent on China, even if it's a small percentage of our total market, is naive because they are our greatest geopolitical threat, and they want to destroy our economy. China's protectionist tariffs on their own side, on the import side, have destroyed from 1977 about 1 million jobs in manufacturing. And currently, we are completely reliant on China for rare earth metals and minerals. Those are the critical supplies that we use, like semiconductors, in our technology. We also use them in our bullets, in our nuclear weapons, in night vision goggles, and infrared missile technology. Where do all these rare earth metals that we so rely on come from for national defense? From China. 96% of the world's supply is from China. And if we don't focus on reshoring our own supply lines, that's going to get exposed if we are ever engaged in a conflict. The whole point about engaging in tariffs over trade and getting in a war there for a short period of time is so that you avoid the shooting war down the line by Taiwan. And it was interesting that our Cato friends mentioned South Korea when it came to the tariffs and what the current rates are now. Because what's been the long-established policy regarding conservative principles on implementing tariffs is that these are a bargaining chip. These are negotiating tools, not to be set in place for long periods of time at astronomical rates, but to bring people to the table. Because if we lower our rates, that doesn't mean other nations will. We have to bring them to the table somehow. They have no economic incentive to come to the table otherwise. The tariffs were meant to actually lower the rates. And what were those rates before? They certainly weren't fair. China used to charge a rate of 97% on American imports, and we only charged them 34%. Japan charged 46%. We charged them 24%. And Indonesia charged 64%. We charged them 32%, about double every single time. And before some of these trade deals started being made by President Donald Trump, the South Korea rate was they were charging us 50%, and we were only charging them 25%. That new rate of zero tariffs on American imports in Japan and Indonesia, in South Korea, is because of the tariffs that brought people to the table to actually make trade deals. That's what this was about. And quite simply, at the end of the day, the reason why we're debating here isn't because conservatives don't like free markets. We love free markets. We understand their power, their ability to create wealth across the whole globe and actually bring people out of poverty. But what we can't do is sacrifice national security for free markets. And we also recognize that you don't have free trade if you don't have fair trade. If you have other nations charging us twice the rates that we charge, that isn't really fair trade. And there's no reason that Americans should be made to be the suckers that have to take these deals when we are one of the greatest economic forces on the globe. There's no reason that we should have to tell the steel worker that they are out of a job when we can renegotiate, when we can make sure that our critical supply lines and our national defense is in fact secured. We know that these have always been negotiating tools. We know that tariffs are not meant to completely straddle the free market and shut it down. That's never been the conservative position. What this is about is making sure that when that critical time comes, when we do get engaged with China, if we ever do, that they can't just cut off our rare earth mineral supply and cut us off from our food, which we are now a significant major importer of. They can't cut us off of all the supplies that we need. That's what the national security point is. And we have to have fair deals. If we want to actually have American first policies and not just take what the globalists give us and sit down and take it, then we have to make sure that we have rates that are fair. That's what the American farmer deserves. That's what the American businessman deserves. That's what our steel workers and coal workers deserve, to not be run out of the market because of aggressive geopolitical enemies. They deserve to have their values, American values, put first and have a fair deal in the marketplace. Thank you.
I'd like to start with a quote. If some domestic capacity is generally necessary for military preparedness, the solution is to subsidize this protection directly and transparently, not to impose trade barriers which hide the true cost from taxpayers and consumers. And that's a quote from the Heritage Foundation. But let's get right into it. Let's talk about their claim about Korea, which they just said that the reason we have free trade with Korea is because of Donald Trump's trade deals. Except Korea has had a free trade agreement with the US since 2012, and wait for it, in Donald Trump's first term, he renegotiated that Korea free trade agreement, and he said it was an immensely fair deal. So it's insane to imply that Korea has a free trade agreement with the US, which has been in place since 2012 because of the bargaining chips. But let's keep on going. Let's talk about the bargaining chip, this idea that tariffs are a bargaining chip. So let's look at one of the successes of the Trump administration, the Vietnam and US free trade deal. So yes, it did eliminate tariff barriers for the US, but the US still has a 20% tariff on Vietnam in this free trade deal. I don't know how free that seems to you, that we're still tariffing them, they're not tariffing us. So let's also go to their point about rare earth minerals. So I'm really glad this got brought up because I'd love to ask them, how exactly do tariffs make our critical mineral chains more secure? The libertarian answer to this security problem is still free trade, because the most efficient solution is diversification and friendshoring. Importing these minerals from allies like Canada or Mexico, or expanding trade with future critical minerals leaders. So we're too dependent on Chinese rare earths? Well, South Africa has the rare earths we need to diversify. Is the US expanding trade ties with South Africa because China is? No, we're threatening them with tariffs. We're building walls between ourselves and the very allies and partners who could help counterbalance China. But I want to go even deeper into it. They say that domestic reshoring in terms of critical minerals is a possibility. But there are some critical minerals where that simply isn't possible. For example, gallium, the US hasn't produced it domestically since 1987. And so the only solution in that case is to import from our allies, for example, Canada and Mexico, which we are also in a trade war with. So how exactly are we in a better national security situation with these tariffs? They also have a fundamental misunderstanding of how trade and risk assessment works, because the US Geological Survey points out that simply relying on a different country is not a supply chain risk. There has to be concentration. For example, the baby formula argument I brought up, there was a concentrated market. There was only 2 major American suppliers. And so when the supply chain came under the risk of the pandemic, that resulted in a complete failure. So we believe that free trade is definitely not being created by these tariffs. Thank you.
So we've got some dispute over some of the factual matters here. And what we need to address is actually how free trade works, how we've resulted in some of the recent trade deals, where they've come from. And regarding the rates, we've got certain different deals with China that are now in place. Why is that? Previously, China had that rate of 97% of a tariff on US imports, and we only tariffed them at 34%. What that rate is now, because of the pressure that was put on by admittedly exorbitantly high tariff rates on China to bring them to the table, has now been lowered. We are now tariffing China at 55%, which is much lower than above the 100% mark that we were tariffing them at to bring them to the table, and China only tariffs us at 10%. Those are the results of the new trade deals that have brought people to the table. And regarding the rare earth minerals, gallium being one of them, the reason why these tariffs were relevant to that is because, yes, right now, China is really the only supplier in the world, except for South Africa. But what were tariffs able to do with China? China had previously completely cut off their supply of rare earth minerals to America, to Europe. The Europe auto industry was about to shut down because they didn't have these supplies. China had already cut us off. This was already a crisis and a catastrophe that had to be remedied. What did the tariffs do? They actually made China commit to supplying us with the rare earth minerals we need. And this is a temporary solution. But what we have to do is, yes, we should reach out to South Africa and try to create these relationships. But no one's just opening their doors and giving us exactly what we want without any incentive. Unfortunately, that's the case. Everyone has market incentives, and would South Africa be incentivized to go ahead and trade with us? Potentially. But we haven't been able to open that door. And tariffs and making these deals, they have brought people to the table. We've seen that with Indonesia. We've seen that with Vietnam. We've seen that with multiple countries, the UK, the EU, and Japan. And in Japan, what they can't refute is, previously, we had a rate of 46% charged on US on US imports. What is it now? It is 0. That is because of the tariffs that brought people to the table. The same is the case with Indonesia. Those rates of 64%, that's now brought to 0 because of the current deals. These do work. Now, the policies, you can dispute how they're being implemented. Are they being sloppily used to bring people to the table? But that's negotiation. It's messy. And what it's about is we have to negotiate on behalf of the American people. We have to put American interests first. We are the United States of America. We are advocating for policies that help the American citizens. It doesn't mean we have exactly free trade if we're tariffing China at 55% when they previously tariffed us at 67% and now they're tariffing us lower. No, that's not flat even. But it is putting American interests first, and it's getting us far closer to those free market positions that even the Cato Institute wants themselves. It's a step in the right direction. And tariffs are just a tool. They're not something that we stand by for all of time. So we support free markets and we want to encourage those kind of relationships with South Africa, but we have to get people to the table, and that's why the tariffs are there.
We're going to go broad for our third topic, and we're going to pose the question, which political philosophy, libertarianism or conservatism, offers the best public policy solutions? And we will begin with the team from the Heritage Foundation.
Edmund Burke wrote that liberty is the design of civil government. But, he wrote, liberty without virtue is the greatest of all possible evils. Virtue requires we recognize human limitation. As G.K. Chesterton noted, we are a part of the democracy of the dead. Conservatives recognize that history didn't begin with us. We inherit a moral order from generations past, from Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem. We have a duty to preserve that, as our Constitution states, for ourselves and our posterity. Conservatism begins with humility. We are not isolated individuals. We are defined by our obligations, not our autonomy. These obligations between a parent and a child, a husband and wife, a citizen and nation, those form the very fabric of free society. Abstract liberty, Burke continued, like other mere abstractions, is not to be found. Liberty inheres in a system of order. Real freedom requires limits. It's duty, not license. It's restraint, not recklessness. Unlike libertarianism, conservatism is not a utopian blueprint. It's the defense of ordered liberty, liberty rooted in tradition. Even libertarian Patrick Henry said, virtue, morality, and religion are the armor that renders liberty invincible. We conserve because we know it can be lost. We restrain because we know what man is capable of. We govern because left unchecked, the appetite for freedom leads to ruin. So what does this ruin look like? Libertarianism treats the breakdown of marriage as a private matter. It tells us not to judge, not to legislate, not to act, to live as you choose, to love who you love. But a society in which family collapse becomes normal, that's a society in crisis. They say the government shouldn't interfere in private life, but they have no answer when 15-year-olds are in foster care, in prison, mothers are left begging for welfare. Libertarian philosophy will always fail, and conservatives are the ones who have to pick up the pieces. Nowhere is the moral emptiness of libertarianism more exposed than in its defense of abortion. Since Roe v. Wade was handed down in 1973, more than 73 million children have been murdered, aborted in the name of choice. And make no mistake, the libertarian mantra of my body, my choice is not morally neutral. It's a death sentence for the unborn. That ideology is not just wrong, it's depraved. The Declaration of Independence does not say we are endowed with the right to convenience. It says we are endowed with the right to life. And yet most libertarians, the founder of the Cato Institute himself, supported abortion. Libertarian thinkers argue that the right to life should be redefined as the right to self-ownership. The proclaimed godfather of libertarianism, quoted on Cato's website, actually claims, and I quote, "Parents should have no legal obligation to feed, clothe, or care for their own children." Are you serious? Wouldn't you be ashamed of that on your website? When you strip away moral duty, you get a world where children are abandoned, where fathers disappear and babies are murdered. Libertarians say the government shouldn't legislate morality, as if the very purpose of government was to instruct what is right and wrong. Every law is a moral statement. We criminalize murder because it is wrong, not because it's inefficient. We outlaw rape and trafficking not to balance a budget, but because we believe in the inherent and beautiful dignity of every single human being. And when libertarians push to legalize prostitution and hard drugs, they send a clear message. There's no higher law, only consent. But conservatives know better. Our founders knew better. They knew that freedom without virtue is no freedom at all. That's where libertarianism fails. It elevates the individual but forgets the soul. It preaches choice but flinches at judgment. It replaces moral law with market logic, and in the process reduces human beings with dignity to consumers. We are not just individuals. We are moral beings, made in the image of God with dignity, created for community, and bound by duty to each other. The law is not the enemy of freedom. It is its guardian. Liberty is not preserved by doing nothing. It's preserved by doing good. Thank you.
Milton Friedman said it best. The most important single central fact about a free market is that no exchange takes place unless both parties benefit. What's true of markets is true of life. When individuals are free to choose, they create value, not just in trade, but in every social and political sphere. The Founding Fathers understood this central principle. Liberty is not a privilege handed out by government. It is our natural right. Madison pointed out that wherever the real power in government lies, there is a danger of oppression. That's why the Constitution was written not as a permission slip for government power, but as a libertarian restraining order against it. And that philosophy leads directly to the heart of libertarianism, the presumption of liberty. David Boas put it, "It is the exercise of power, not the exercise of liberty, that requires justification." The government doesn't get to ask, "Why should you be free?" It has to answer, "Why should we restrict you?" And that principle, demanding moral and legal justification for every expansion of state power, has never been more pressing. There's a rise of a protectionist state that turns its back on the world. There are attacks on the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. The conservative side will tell you that these actions are justified because of some pressing emergency, whether it's a threat from China or an invasion that justifies suspending habeas corpus. But as Hayek said, emergencies have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of individual liberty have been eroded. But if emergencies are the excuse today, what's stopping them from becoming the default tomorrow? The conservatives will also claim, and they just did, that unchecked freedom leads to vice and social decay because they think government control is the only source of control and order. But in the same way that the invisible hand of the market produces economic order and price signals, freedom in the social realm enables what Friedrich Hayek called a spontaneous order of moral and civic life. Why did charities emerge without government intervention? Why does civil society exist? There is a massive network of market signals, civil society checks, social norms, and NGOs that all emerged without government intervention. Do you know who laid the groundwork for international human rights law? Because it wasn't the government, it was NGOs in 1945. You see the spontaneous moral order in your own life. Your friends watch your choices, your family shapes your values, your workplace, your community, your church, they all form a web of expectations and trust. I agree with my conservative friend. We don't live in isolation. We live in a network of shared understanding, social norms, and voluntary cooperation. That is the human condition, and libertarians recognize its simple brilliance. We also know that the economy isn't like a computer that takes in inputs and spits out output. It's people, billions of them, thinking, creating, risking, and trading. Trade is an ancient and fundamentally human form of interaction. And at its heart, the case for free trade begins with a simple question. Why should the government interfere in one of our most basic forms of human interaction? We wouldn't accept the state telling us who to love, what to believe, or how to speak. Why should it dictate who we can trade with? And here's the thing, the state claims order, but enforces it through threat because its only tool is coercion. Markets offer order too, but one that emerges peacefully through cooperation, mutual benefit, and consent. Libertarianism stands for that kind of order, an order that grows not from power, but from freedom. At a time when government seeks to expand control in the name of crisis, we must return to first principles, that no emergency, no ideology, and no authority justifies violating the dignity and autonomy of the individual. But they claim on the conservative side that because we prioritize individuals, we don't care about family, which simply isn't true. We believe in families, so strongly in fact that we don't think the government should be in the business of tearing them apart. Every time the state locks someone up for a nonviolent offense, seizes a parent's income through civil asset forfeiture, or regulates childcare into oblivion, it's families who pay the price. And the idea that the government can impose virtue. So if you're a parent, do you take your kid up to Capitol Hill to teach him how to be a good person? Of course not. You teach him at home. You pass on what you know. You send him to school. You help him find good friends. The conservatives say that people are self-interested. And they're right. But here's the thing. The government is made up of people too. And as far as I know, there's no angels or robots running Washington. Just flawed, self-interested human beings, just the same as the rest of it. We insist on government accountability because no president, left or right, should be able to rewrite laws or suspend rights on a whim. And we deeply value individual rights because without free speech, without due process and equal protection under the law, none of the other freedoms matter. And at a time when power is expanding faster than accountability, these principles aren't radical. They're the only moral foundation on which a free society can stand. Thank you.
As conservatives, we recognize that everyone is self-interested. But for us to have a society that we have based on self-interest that is productive, we also recognize that this is based on an assumption that John Adams also noted, that our Constitution was designed for a moral and religious people. And we don't always have that, for better or worse. And this is why we have a republic and not a democracy. We want to secure individual rights. But we also need to recognize something that anyone who's taken an economics class knows occurs. Broken markets. Sometimes the incentives don't point where virtue is. And that's where we have a republic, where we have a nation of laws, not of men. One such example, when we have open borders, what is the national incentive? We find that there is an incentive for coyotes to smuggle children and traffic them across the border. What do we find as the incentive? We find that corporations monopolize. What do we find as the incentive? We find that people want to have legal prostitution and that we want to be able to have access for pornography to children, and we want to actually allow people to do whatever they want as long as it doesn't harm anyone. But you have to have limits in a nation that is built on moral laws. That's simply what you have to have. And the Cato Institute is not shy about this. The Cato Institute supports legalization of prostitution. In 2023, they had an op-ed on this. The Cato Institute doesn't require that anyone should have a legal obligation to clothe and feed their own children. Now you might be asking, well, why does that matter? We can kind of count on everyone to do that. But when you have open borders, you can't rely on the same assumptions. When you have market influences that cause people to want to pursue vices, you can't rely on those same moral assumptions. And what keeps the conservative from legislating everything? What keeps anyone from legislating everything on this basis? The good news. We have a constitution. We have federalism. Men are not angels, and even men in government are not angels. But that's why we have separation of powers, checks and balances. That's what this republic is built on, to help us produce laws, to help mitigate these broken markets, these bad incentives, and produce the best laws that we can. But we can't give up on basic, fundamental moral principles that we should have age verifications to keep children from accessing porn online, that we shouldn't have prostitution in the streets, that we shouldn't legalize opioids and hard drugs. There are some basic fundamental things that we would hope we could agree on. And our republic, our checks and balances, our separation of powers helps maintain that.
So I'm not super sure what economics class my conservative friend took, because I learned about checks and balances in my political science class and my economics in a different one. But let's get straight into what they said about the fact that the government should be able to tell parents to feed and clothe their child. Here's the thing, libertarians have a non-aggression principle, and if there's genuine harm being done, we do say that the government should interfere. But here's the thing, if Congress passed a law that said children should be fed and clothed, and if not, you get thrown in jail, they already do. We're not debating abstract policy that's already happened. Conservatives say that liberty needs moral guardrails, but every tyrant in history has claimed the same for the sake of order. We say guardrails are fine when built by families, communities, and voluntary associations, not by threat of violence. So why are we debating abstract policy solutions instead of actual policy solutions that matter? Because laws against child abuse and child protection already exist, so I don't know why we're having this abstract debate. Let's go straight into an actual debate, because in their first speech they mentioned hard drugs. So I'm going to tell a story because today seems to be a lot of storytelling going on. Luis is a Portuguese citizen who was once addicted to heroin. Today he's alive because of a van. Not a courtroom, not a prison, a van. So methadone is a substance that's highly effective at reducing cravings for opioids like heroin. So in Lisbon, it's distributed through mobile vans that bring these medications directly to those in need. Luis said, "The van changed my life. I would be dead without it." So I'd like to point to the example of Ares de Pinhol, a nonprofit NGO that operated many of these vans. Notice how a community can originate change and save lives. Our drug policy starts from a humane standpoint. You know what's not humane? The war on drugs. Throwing millions of people away in prisons, destroying lives, and separating families without reducing the availability of illicit drugs or the power of criminal organizations. Luis is one of millions helped by Portugal's humane, health-centered approach to drug use. One type of policy offered him a second chance. If he was in the US, he would be offered a criminal record that would follow him for life. So let's debate actual policy. The war on drugs has failed, morally, economically, and practically. It has filled our prisons, drained our budgets, and devastated lives without solving the problem it claims to fix. Decades of punitive policy have only fueled a deadlier drug supply, entrenched inequality, and empowered criminal networks. Meanwhile, humane, liberty-based approaches like Portugal's have reduced harm at a fraction of the cost. The path forward is not more overcriminalization, it's more freedom, more care, and policies that treat people, not punish them. So the state shouldn't be a parent, it should be a guardrail for our property rights, our life, and our liberty. Thank you.
So that rebuttal was an excellent segue to our lightning round, where each side will give 2-minute responses to 3 questions. And the first question is, should hard drugs be legalized? And so I'm going to turn to Team Heritage to provide a response. The first response.
No. We have a resounding no on this, and not only that, we know what the implications are when this happens. Oregon's tried to legalize hard drugs. They did that back in 2020 during the COVID era. When Oregon legalized small amounts of hard drugs, things like cocaine and heroin, what happened? Overdose spiked by 66%. We saw that even the illegal drug market spiked, even though we had legalized hard drugs in Oregon. We didn't see anything that was positive coming out of that policy, and in 2024, Oregon recognized that and actually reversed on the policy of legalizing hard drugs.
We'll begin the clock again. Team Cato, your response.
I want to be clear about something. Drug use needs to be seen as a health issue rather than a criminal issue. That's how it's currently been seen. Libertarians are in support of decriminalization because putting people in prison for non-violent personal choices doesn't make our country safer, but it does destroy their lives. The war on drugs, as my partner mentioned, has failed on every metric. We've spent over $1 trillion. All we have to show for it is the highest incarceration rate in the world. Despite all of that, the US leads in overdoses, with over 109,000 Americans dead in 2022. And prohibition doesn't eliminate drugs, it just makes them more dangerous. When people can't access drugs legally, they turn to black markets. Black markets where there's no labeling, there's no dosage control, no safety standards. That's how fentanyl spreads. That's how doses happen. It's not drug use that's killing people, but the policies that push it into the shadows. And when it's criminalized, people are afraid to seek help. They don't go to doctors or clinics, and they hide their addiction until it becomes a crisis. Now, our conservative friends point to the case of Oregon and argue that decriminalization or legalization has failed. But what actually failed was the implementation. They slashed addiction treatment by nearly 60% during the same period. At the same time, just putting those people into prison doesn't actually help the issue. All it does is hide it and exacerbate it. As my partner mentioned, Portugal offers a much clearer example of how to approach drug policy. They decriminalized all drugs in 2001, and they've seen an overdose drop in 80%. Instead of punishment, they offered health services to people, and they treated the drug crisis as a health problem, not as a crime problem. We've tried criminalization for decades, and it's failed. It's time to approach the problem a little bit more compassionately in a way that will actually get results.
My next question is on tech policy, and we'll begin with Cato. So I asked Team Cato, what restrictions on the development of artificial intelligence should be placed, and why? Or why not?
So libertarians, I think, will raise two important considerations when it comes to AI policy. The first off is that these companies are developing much too fast for us to regulate them in most ways, for us to efficiently regulate them. We're always going to be playing catch up, which is why instead we should allow them to grow and innovate for a period of time. We should let them innovate freely until the sort of dust of progress settles a little bit. At the same time, by allowing sort of a deregulated approach to AI, we're going to allow small contributors, small innovators to get a piece of the pie and also to bring ideas to the table. If we bring in regulation now, what we're going to see big tech come in and basically lobby Congress until everyone else is locked out and they have more control and a monopoly on AI, which cannot happen. The one place where libertarians will, I think, advise regulation is in data privacy. It's very, very important that Americans are able to protect their data and are able to benefit from it. So that's where we would advise strong laws in order to protect people's data and allow them to use it, whether that means selling it or somehow benefiting off of it.
Heritage?
We have a lot of agreement there. We agree that there should be relatively low actual enforcement or regulation of tech, because this is an evolving field. Now, there are some areas where we have to watch out and look for ways this can be abused. We're not going to say there's zero regulation that should be applied, but once again, this is an emerging field. And we want to be the leaders in AI, because if we aren't, someone else will be. And that's really important, both for our industry purposes and for national defense. And the only thing that we would recognize is this kind of has to do with the trade policy issues that were addressed. We don't want to be importing any technologies that would benefit, say, China, our geopolitical adversary. That's something that we would watch out for. So that's where you're looking at import controls and things along those lines. But in terms of regulation, usually when the government gets involved with technology, it tends to be involved in censorship, as we've seen with online media, and that's something that's worth avoiding. You don't want to create that cabal. But at the end of the day, we also want to watch out for Section 230, because if we are going to say that social media companies, for instance, are going to be independent, then they need to be held accountable. They can't have it both ways. They can't both have publisher protections and also have protections from the government and try to have everything that they want both ways. So when it comes to AI policy, general deregulation, but overall, yes, we do need some limited guardrails.
Foreign policy question. The president recently arranged a deal by which NATO countries would purchase weapons from the United States and then transfer them to Ukraine. Heritage, do you support this policy? If so, why? If not, why not?
So with the policy when it comes to transporting weapons to Ukraine, we've had some split factions on this particular point. But overall, when you look at Ukraine, they're kind of in a losing battle right now. And we've got mixed positions in the administration even on whether or not we should be sending weapons to Ukraine. But when you look at the situation, you have Russia coming in. we've generally supported giving some broad support to Ukraine in some ways, whether that's financially, whether that's through weapons. But some of that's being moderated depending on how peace negotiations are being met. But you don't want Russia ultimately taking over Ukraine. You have to draw a line somewhere. You would want NATO, most importantly, to step up and take the lead on this and and that's what Trump has been doing through some of these summits that have been going on. You want NATO, you want European nations to step up their commitment so that not only do we not have to deal with these issues as much, but they're more equipped to it. They're closer to the war themselves. Whether or not they have the funds, that's where we do have to support our allies, but we want them to step up in their commitments.
Team Cato, your thoughts on the president's policy to sell weapons to NATO allies who would then transfer them to Ukraine?
So first of all, we definitely agree with the Heritage Foundation interns when they said that we should de-entangle ourselves and step back and let Europeans come in and actually maintain these security alliances. Transporting weapons has always been a contentious issue. We dealt with this issue when we talked about Taiwan back in the 1900s. We believe that NATO expansionism has been devastating. For decades, U.S. leaders, they pursued NATO expansion eastward, and they pushed a Cold War military alliance ever closer to Russia's borders. And at every step, there were voices of restraint that warning this path could spark a lot of confrontation. So George Kennan, he was a former Soviet containment architect. He called it the most fateful error of American policy in the post-Cold War era to move NATO eastward. So this is a classic security dilemma in place. What one side sees as defense, the other sees as threat. So NATO enlargement, which was framed as protection, became an escalation. Ted Gallen at the Cato Institute has written about this and said that by ignoring Russia's security concerns, NATO expansion turned a weakened former adversary into a cornered one. So I think drawing on this history, when we talk about increasing the strength of Ukraine by sending them weapons, it could also trigger another security dilemma, and we need to be really careful and prudent. And we really believe that today's Washington's foreign policy establishment insists that NATO expansionism was about defending democracy, but at what cost? There were trillions spent on defense, thousands of American lives in far-off conflicts, and now we're at the risk of a new Cold War with a nuclear-armed adversary. I think we need to be really prudent about these kind of weapon transfers. Thank you.
We turn now to closing statements, and we'll begin with Cato.
We've heard a lot tonight about principles, policies, and the role of government. But as the night comes to a close, I want to share something a little different, a more personal story on liberty. I want to tell everyone a little bit about my mom. My mom was born in China in 1974. She grew up in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, just as the country was starting to see a period of economic liberalization. My mom grew up in a society of state-dictated morality, where the government enforced its single vision of what was best for everyone. In fact, I remember her telling me how lucky she felt to have a brother, because just a few years later, that wouldn't have been allowed under the one-child policy. But she also talked to me about what it was like to grow up amid China's rapid rise in wealth as the country opened its doors to enterprise and trade. This growth in wealth, it brought little joys, like her first taste of Ferrero Rochers, still her favorite chocolate today. And it also brought big ones, like the savings that allowed her family to send my 23-year-old mom all the way across the world to study at American University, right here in Washington, D.C. Years later, she met my dad, also here in D.C. Just a generation earlier, their marriage would have been illegal under the miscegenation laws of this country's past. But over time, this country moved away from this moral dictation towards liberty. She went on to start a small legal practice, build a life in Virginia, raise a very handsome son, perhaps a more humble daughter. But why am I sharing this story? Because I think it captures something that libertarians often struggle to explain, what liberty actually feels like. Because it's not some abstract principle. It's not a utopian ideal. No, it's Ferrero Rocher chocolates and an unconventional marriage. It's 6,000 miles from home until a Virginia townhouse becomes one. And it's a product of something that's really quite simple: our own choices. Our ideas about what's good or bad for society will always be changing. A generation before theirs, my parents' marriage would have been legal. And when my mom was growing up in China, having a second child would have been against the law. And not so long ago, women weren't expected to start businesses, they were expected to work for men who did. That's why we shouldn't build our society around whatever moral vision happens to be popular at the time. What's considered virtuous today can change in a generation, or it can change in an election cycle. That's why we shouldn't hand power to the state. That's why we should build our society around liberty, because liberty endures. That's the foundation that my mom found here. That's what brought her across the world, gave her the freedom to build a life and to raise two. Let's make sure we protect it.
And one of the things that we want to recognize here is there is a lot of agreement between the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute on fundamental principles, on the vision of liberty. It was a beautiful vision that Ben's mom got to actually see and participate in that. And one of the things that we at the Heritage Foundation are cognizant of and worried about is, yes, we recognize that there are threats to liberty that arise, sometimes even in government. But we also want to have policies in place that make sure that the blessings of that liberty and that posterity, it actually continues for generations. Because if there is no moral vision, that's an amoral vision. And that's what causes degradation of a society over time and that loss of liberty. The founding fathers knew this. George Mason said in the Virginia Declaration of Rights that no free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people, but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, and by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. We have to have fundamental principles. We have to have some basic guidelines. And we also have to have a constitution, which we do have, that prevents the abuses, that prevents miscegenation laws, that prevents anything that would go against our rights. That's why we have a republic and not a democracy, because we don't have just free mob rule. But at the end of the day, that does mean that we have to have some principles. And there were some unanswered questions in this debate that I want you to think about when we leave tonight. Realize that there were some stances that need to be taken that simply weren't if we want to maintain our moral order. We never got an answer about if we should ever deport criminals, if we should ever deport those who are murderers, who are child rapists. We didn't get any instance of a policy that would enforce the border from the Cato Institute. Now, if you have people that are coming in legally, they're the ones who are having their liberties stripped. When you have illegal immigrants who didn't come the right way, like Ben's mom, and they're destroying communities, they're causing harm. We have to actually have legal immigration and enforcement against illegal immigration to make sure that those blessings are maintained. And you never heard from the Cato Institute any policies that would actually secure our borders and actually maintain the nation that we have. You also never heard of any restrictions on the nation of China regarding trade, even though they are our geopolitical enemy. We have to recognize this, that China does want to destroy our economy. They do eventually want to take us over. That is what they think. That is what they want. They want our market share. They want us to actually be at their will, be under their whim. Does that mean that we should have complete free trade with them? No. We should have prudent principles that actually look out for when we're relying on Chinese tech. We should find ways to reach out to other countries like South Africa. We should use the tools and the tariffs that we have to get deals that help us have free trade and fair trade with our allies and mitigate the risks of national security. But we never got any instance where we should actually look out for national security. We never got any instance where we should try to actually make people come to the table to give us our due and give us fair trade as American citizens. And then when it comes to the philosophy, we really didn't hear that there was ever any limit to liberty. And liberty without limit, that's not ordered liberty. That's chaos. That's anarchy. We need to actually have orders. If we don't have ordered liberty, then we're going to legalize drugs. We're going to legalize prostitution. We're going to have children accessing pornography at will. We never got answers to those questions from the Cato Institute. We never got any answers about what the limits of ordered liberty are. We ask you to draw the line. Draw the line at open borders. Draw the line at legalization of practices you know are morally abhorrent, and choose conservative policies that put America first. Thank you.
Let's have another round of applause for our debaters. And of course, thank you once again to Matthew Continetti for moderating tonight. And we hope you have all enjoyed the debate, everyone. A very special and emphatic thanks to the Cato Events, AV, and security teams. Their hard work has been integral to what we've put on here tonight. If you're interested in these kinds of topics and delving into political philosophy and economic theory, we encourage you to check out Libertarianism.org, as well as the numerous opportunities available for students and young professionals at the Cato Institute. Lastly, just a reminder about that post-debate survey. We would love your responses to that once it arrives in your inboxes in the coming days. Thanks again for coming out, everyone. On floors 1 and 2 outside, we will have a reception, and we hope you will join us. Thank you. Hey, fantastic. Great job, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Fantastic.